All right, in that last menu video, you heard me talk about either shooting in a stills mode or in the movie mode. What I'm going to be talking about real quick is just kind of the pros and cons of shooting in each. All right, we're going to talk about the movie mode first. It's pretty much what you see is what you get, or what you see is what you're about to record. Now, kind of the opposite is true when you're shooting in a stills mode. What you see on the monitor before you hit record is not necessarily what you're going to get. You're going to notice that the exposure is going to change slightly. The colors are going to change slightly. It's not a very accurate representation of what's going to happen when you hit the record button. One of the nice things about recording in movie mode is you always have the correct aspect ratio. That's not true when you're shooting in a stills mode. The stills mode, before you hit record, you'll see a 3:2 aspect ratio, and then once you hit record, it'll go to 16:9. In movie mode, you can control the audio level before you hit record and during recording, but on stills, you can only do it after you hit record. In movie mode, you will always have the audio meters. In stills mode, you'll only get them once you hit record. In movie mode, clear image zoom works all the time. In stills mode, it works some of the time. I say sometimes because if you're in RAW or RAW plus JPEG, you will not be able to use clear image zoom. Picture profiles will always work in movie mode. They will sometimes work in stills mode. I say sometimes because if you're in silent shooting and you have that turned on, you will not be able to access the picture profiles. You get around this, of course, get out of silent shooting, go into picture profiles, set the way you want, and then you can go back into silent shooting. All right, time remaining, that number that you see in the upper left-hand corner of your screen will always be there in movie mode, whether you're recording or not. In stills mode, you won't see that until after you hit record. And the last benefit for shooting in movie mode is you have more HDMI output options. You can output 4K, but when you're in a stills mode, you will not be able to output 4K at all. All right, let's talk about the benefits of shooting movies in a stills mode. The one I love the most is being able to punch in once and twice, and you get a really enlarged image in which to focus upon, and it's wonderful. It's just a great tool. A lot of times when I'm shooting in movie mode, I can only punch in once, and there's just not enough zoom in punch in function to grab focus accurately. And a lot of times I will just, when I'm shooting in movie mode, I will just, if I'm wanting to get critical focus, I'll skip over quickly to like M mode on the dial, punch in twice, get some great focus, and then I'll go back to movie mode. The next thing I like about shooting in stills mode is you'll actually get the distance scale. So when you're moving the barrel, you'll actually see the distance scale appear, and you can find out just how far away your object is. The next feature I don't use that often, but manual focus assist. Remember, if you reach for the barrel and you start turning it, it'll punch in automatically, and then you release the barrel, it'll actually go back to where it was before. That's a great option if you like shooting that way. All right, DMF focus. What's kind of cool about this in stills mode is when you press the shutter halfway down, it acquires focus. Let's say you're gonna interview somebody, you're like, oh, grab focus, great, I got him. And then you hit record, well, all that focus kind of goes out the window because then it reverts to automatic focus continuous. AF illuminator, you can use that in stills mode, but you can't use that in movie mode. So if you're trying to acquire focus in a very dimly lit area, you can definitely get that light to turn on and help you grab focus easier. And the last benefit for shooting movies in a stills mode is you can actually take pictures in that mode as well. In movie mode, you can't take pictures, unfortunately. So just to recap really quickly, in stills mode, you get access to a lot of great autofocus features. In movie mode, you get what you see is what you get, or what you see is what you're about to record. All right, next up is exposure. I'm gonna be teaching you how to technically get a really correct exposure. But really when it comes down to it, exposure is very subjective, what the correct exposure is. I mean, some people might think, you know what, I don't like that image because I think it needs to be a third of a stop brighter. And some people might say, oh, I like it a little bit darker. And like I demonstrated before, it depends on which picture profile you're using. Because if you're using S-Log, I might be overexposing a lot in camera, but then later on, bringing it down in post. All right, making this part of the course is kind of tough because I know there's basically two separate audiences that watch this course. There's one that maybe this is their second or third camera. Maybe they had Canon before this and they're trying to learn more about Sony, and they're watching this course for the menu chapter, they're watching it for the S-Log chapter, they're watching it for other things. But there's actually the true beginner, the person that has never operated this type of camera before. And that's what this kind of next section is going to be about. All right, for you beginners out there that maybe have only shot video with an iPhone before, perhaps you've actually touched on the screen, touched on the sun symbol, and raised the exposure or lowered the exposure on your phone. That's maybe the only exposure that you've had to exposure. We're going to be talking about the three things that make up exposure on this camera for video, which is ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Now, on this camera, and in terms of video, you will not see the word exposure anywhere on this camera. It's like, where is it? How can I raise it or lower it? You won't find it, basically. One exception to that, and like I talked about before, you can adjust exposure for video with the exposure compensation dial. But again, like I talked about before, I don't really recommend using this dial at all. All right, of the three things that we talked about that make up exposure, shutter speed is by far the easiest. It's almost like a set and forget type of thing. There's two types of shutters in this camera. There's the mechanical shutter. So when you're shooting stills like 10 frames a second. Or there's the electronic shutter, which you don't hear at all. It's totally silent. We need at least 120 frames per second in video, and this thing can only do like, what, 10 frames a second in stills? That's as fast as it can do with mechanical shutter. And basically what a shutter is, a mechanism, if you think of it mechanically, it's kind of the same concept electronically, it's just turning on and off. Basically the shutter opens, allows light in for a certain duration, and then basically closes it again. All right, so let's demonstrate some shutter speed. So if we go to record setting, we set this to 24p. I'm going to take the shutter speed from a 50th and I'm going to go down to a 15th. So now we're at a 15th, and let's go ahead and see what that looks like with my golf swing. As you can see, there is a ton of motion blur, because basically what's happening is that electronic shutter is basically turning on and off, and it's allowing a 15th of a second of light basically to hit it. And during that time, you can see from here, there's a lot of motion blur in my golf swing. And it doesn't look right. It doesn't look natural. So now we're going to go into the shutter speed, and we're going to change this to a 50th of a second. We've hit what's called the 180-degree roll. And simply put, you take the record setting of 24p, the 24, just double it. And that gives you 48. The closest thing we've got in terms of shutter speed is a 50th. So we're going to go ahead and bring that to a 50th. Let's take a look at what that looks like. And as you can see, that looks very normal. It looks very natural. And that's kind of the way your eye sees it, that amount of motion blur. So let's go ahead and try something even more extreme than 15th of a second. We're going to go all the way to a thousandth of a second. So again, we're only allowing a thousandth of a second light to hit the sensor each time it turns on and off. And as you can see, it's very choppy. It's very staccato. It's very, I don't know what the correct word is, but if we stop mid-swing, you can see that the golf club has a little bit of motion blur on it, but you look at my hands, which are moving slower, there's like no motion blur on my hands at all. All right, let's demonstrate another shutter speed. So we're going to go up to a 60p, and then we're going to go into here. We're going to bring this all the way down like we did before. We're going to bring this down to a 15th of a second. We'll take a look at what that looks like with 60p. So as you can see, it's just kind of very blurry, kind of missing frames kind of look. And when we slow it down, like here, you can see it's just very jerky but smeary kind of look to it. So now what we'll do is we'll go and increase from 15th of a second. We'll bring this up to 180-degree roll. So we're going to take 60p, double it. You get 120. Closest thing we've got is 125th. So let's take a look. Here's normal speed, and it kind of looks a little choppy, but not too bad. But when we slow it down, it looks perfect. This is the way your eye would normally see it. It looks perfectly smooth. All right, let's do another example of shutter speed. So let's go all the way to 120p. We're actually going to keep the shutter where it is at 125th. Let's go ahead and take a look. When we look at 125th, it looks pretty good. It looks pretty natural. And then when we take that same clip and we slow it down, we can see that it looks really nice and smooth. We're actually not at the correct 180-degree roll shutter. Let's go ahead and change that, and we're going to go from 125th to 250, because if you take 120, double it, it's 240. Closest thing is 250. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Looks a little staccato-y, I guess you could say right there, but when we slow it down and we're shooting for slow motion, You can see that is the correct 180-degree shutter. But when you compare the two, here's the 125th on the left, 250 on the right. They both look pretty good. And let's go ahead and stop it right kind of at the apex, or no, we'll stop it right here where you can see it in the against a blue sky. You can definitely see the 125th has a little bit more motion blur than 250th. So rules are meant to be broken, and we could definitely break the rule here when we're shooting outside in daylight, and we could get 125th look pretty good. It looks pretty fluid when you compare it to 250th of a second. So if you're light challenged and you don't have enough light, because what's happening is we're only opening and closing that shutter at 250th of a second, which is not allowing much light in, which means we're going to have to bring up or change our aperture or bring up our ISO, which we're going to cover more about later. So if you ever find yourself in a situation where you're light challenged and you need more light, you could try 125th, because I think the amount of motion blur you get there actually looks pretty decent. Also, you might shoot at 125th indoors, depending on the lights, because a lot of times when you change the shutter speed around, you can find the sweet spot at which those artificial lights are synchronized to, basically, so you can avoid banding. So if we're shooting at 250th indoors for 120p and you're getting a lot of banding, you might want to move that down and try different locations, maybe 160th, 200, and find out where it kind of matches that frequency to get rid of that flickering and banding effect that you might have. All right, just to recap shutter speed, basically shutter speed does two things for you. The first one is creative, which is motion blur, which we've already discussed. The second one's more technical, and it's just basically how much light it allows in. So as I increase the shutter speed number, as you can see, I'm up to 1/500th of a second, it's very dark, and as I bring it down, it gets very bright. Of the three elements that make up exposure, ISO will probably get you into trouble the fastest. It's the one that can degrade your image if you're not careful. Now there's sometimes that you can bring your footage in and it might look clean, and then sometimes it might not. Here we are at ISO 800, and on the left we have a light colored clothing against a white background, and on the right we've got a dark colored clothing on a black background. And where does the noise live? It lives in the shadows, in those darker areas. So there's sometimes that you're going to be shooting this camera, you're going to get in results, you're going to say, wow, 12,800 looks beautifully clean. And sometimes you're going to be looking at it and say, it doesn't look clean at all. And a lot of it has to do is what's in your frame. If there's a lot of dark objects that kind of live in like between 0 and like 30 IRE, a lot of it's really a dark image. Well, you're going to get a lot of noise. And like I've showed before, if it's a very bright image, you have a bright background, white clothing, well, you can push that ISO pretty hard. Now, like I demonstrated before in my previous video, shooting in the full frame mode will give you the cleanest results compared to like the crop mode. Now, that being said, those differences between the two that I was showing were not as drastic as what we had on the previous camera. The a7Riii, that was a big, massive difference between shooting in crop mode versus full frame, because crop on that previous camera was really clean. On this camera, the differences are kind of subtle. They're not huge. So if you're in a situation where you need more reach out of your lens and you want to go to crop mode and you're shooting at, let's say, 6400, go ahead and do it, because you're only going to be adding just a little bit more noise than the full frame version. One of the things you might notice as you get in really high ISOs like 6400, 12,800, 32,000 is the colors are going to shift. Basically, those colors are going to shift. If you were to look at a vector scope, you're going to see them shift slightly. So the hues of those colors are going to be a little bit different. You're going to also notice that the saturation, like in my skin, is going to be lower as you increase the ISO. And the third thing you're probably going to notice, just because of the amount of noise that's in the image, it kind of softens the image and takes away a lot of that detail and sharpness. Now, one of the hardest tasks you can give to your computer when video editing is adding noise reduction. So let's say you brought some footage in, you shot it at 12,800 or something, and it's really noisy and you've got a lot of dark things in the image and it just looks bad. It's not usable. So what do? You add some noise reduction, it cleans it up, looks pretty good, maybe got a little better. But what's the problem is you've got the CPU, the GPU, your rendering times, even your creativity, everything just goes down. Things become slower, you're skipping frames, and it's just a big hassle. The best thing to do is try to get it right in camera. If you've got a controlled lighting situation, maybe bring up some ambient light, maybe change the wardrobe. Try to get it to the point where you can lower the ISO by maybe adding more light, and that'll save you some nightmares in post if you have somewhat of a wimpy computer. So like I said before, shutter speed, we've pretty much set that one. So we got two other ones. We got aperture and ISO. So which one do you change first? Like I said before, you want to shoot pretty much with the lowest ISO. Right here, as you can see, we're at ISO 100, but the image looks really dark. So I could either bring up the ISO, or what's better is really to change your aperture first. Now it depends, and we're going to talk about depth of field later, but if I would bring down your aperture first, and then if you needed more light, then I would start bringing up your ISO until you get a properly exposed image. Now if you did that exercise that I talked about in the very first video, where I said just take your camera, if you haven't changed anything, it's fully auto the way it came out of the box, and go shoot around your house. Shoot some dark spaces, go light spaces, and bring in your computer and see what happened. You might have noticed some of the images looked really good, and some of the images might look really noisy. You might have chosen a bad combination of like f-stop, shutter speed, and all that stuff. So let's take a look here. So here's our example from before. I'm f2.8 ISO 160, and then if I change the ISO to auto, and then I go in here to exposure mode and go back to where the camera came, which I believe was in program auto, let's take a look at what it decided to do. Here you can see it's at f2.8. You see I can try changing the aperture, it doesn't do anything for me, and I don't know what the ISO is. My guess is it's probably around 160 like we had before. So in this instance, it made some pretty good decisions. But like I talked about before, when you're in program auto, sometimes it just doesn't make the best decisions. And if you looked at some of your footage, you probably noticed some really grainy, noisy images that you got. All right, so we talked about shutter speed. That's pretty much set and forget. We talked about ISO, tried to keep it as low as possible. That leaves aperture. An aperture of the three is probably your most creative tool that you have. It controls your depth of focus, your depth of field, basically. I'm going to demonstrate that with this blower here in a second. But what I want to say is, I could show you a Wikipedia page and try to explain all the math and try to, say at this distance, at f1.8, what's your depth of field? I'm not going to do any sort of depth of field calculators because I don't even understand the math. It's pretty complex, understanding how to calculate all that stuff. So what we're going to do is I'm just basically going to demonstrate what depth of field is with this particular lens. So if I take the blower and then I focus, let's say, on the background. There's the background. I'm just doing this all manually. And if I go back to the blower, let's say right about there, and I've got focus peaking on so I can kind of see what I'm doing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that the ISO is on auto. And what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to focus between the two objects. I would say maybe right about here. And what I'm going to do is increase the f-stop number, which should increase the depth of field, which should make both of these objects, which are only like maybe 10 inches apart, both in focus. So let's go ahead and increase. So we'll go up to like f8 to begin with. And they're both still out of focus, especially the chart in the background. Go up to like f16, f15, and f22. And as I can see, focus peaking wise, the blower is in focus and the background is also in focus. So what's happened is as I've increased the f-stop number, it's increased the depth of field or your depth of focus, however you want to talk about it. Now if you have a lens like this, it's the 55mm 1.8 to f22, and you're a brand new beginner to this, the best example I can give to you to explain how not to be confused of these numbers, because you might be thinking f22 like we have here is must be a very large opening, and then f1.8 must be a very small opening. Well, it's not. It's actually quite the opposite. Think of it as like a zero entry swimming pool for little kids that come in and safely can get into the water. Well, if the kids go in a couple of inches, think of that as like f2. So f2 maybe equals 2 inches, very shallow. There's not much depth of field there. So if you're filming somebody, let's say like 10 feet away on a lens like this, the 7200, they might only be like 2 inches of depth of field. But then if you go to the deep end of the pool and it's 22 feet deep, think of that as f22, that depth of the pool, depth of field, depth of focus basically becomes much larger. So pretty much everything becomes in focus. Or I have another exercise for you. I think this is a good exercise to do if you do a lot of interviews. Take a measuring tape, bring it out about 6 feet, and take a lens like the 55 at 1.8 and put it at 1.8, and then put peaking on your camera, and then take on manual focus, just move it around that 6 foot mark. And that might be very typical to where you set the camera a distance from the actual person who is being interviewed. And you want to understand how much of that is going to be in focus. And let's go ahead and take a look. I ran this example myself. So I've got two views here. The lower right has the peaking turned on, and as you can see on the large image, that is without peaking. And you get an idea, and you see I just punched in. You can see I've got about, I don't know, about 2, maybe 3 inches of stuff that's really in focus. So I don't know, about maybe that much. So when you're filming somebody and you want to get their eyes in focus, and they're about 6 feet away from the camera, and that depth of field is moving about that much, they don't have to move much like this. Like if they move in, remove their glasses to make a point, you don't want to be shooting at f.8, because when they do that move like that, then they're going to be out of focus. And right now I'm filming at f5.6, and I can move in and out quite a bit. So what you want to do is move your aperture to 5.6, put on like focus peaking like I talked about in that exercise, and understand how much larger that becomes. And do that with all your different lenses at kind of, I would say, the typical, wherever your typical interviewing distance is. And I think that's a great exercise, because with that kind of knowledge going into an interview, you're like, well, I know this person moves around a lot. I might want to be at 5.6, or this person doesn't move much and I really have kind of a nasty background I want to blur all the way out. And I know that person's not going to move at all. He's like a rock. Well, go ahead and shoot at f1.8. Go ahead and set your focus. And like I demonstrated before, on this new camera, I'm kind of changing my ways. Before in interviews, I would always do manual focus, kind of find out the sweet spot. But now with autofocus on this camera being so good with face detection, I'm shooting at like f1.8 sometimes because the autofocus is so good. All right, let's say you're setting up for an interview for a CEO, and the CEO does not have a handler. Usually they have somebody who will be around. Somebody will be around with you while you're trying to find a location, maybe at the, let's say it's a vineyard, for instance. And you can say, hey, can you go ahead and stand where the CEO is going to be? I can get my camera settings adjusted just right. But let's say there's nobody there. So you reach into your bag and you grab like a gray card like I have here, and you go ahead and zoom in on the gray card. Maybe it's you're putting on a seat where he's going to sit down, and you got your lights set up. Lights are shining on the gray card. If you go in and you get the light meter to where it is right here at 0.0, you're going to be really close. Like for instance, we're at 50th of a second f4, because I know, or I think I know, the CEO is not going to move around that much, and ISO 400. So when I say he's not going to move around that much, I'm using manual focus and I'm not using any sort of autofocus. Let's say the CEO comes in, you take the gray card out, he's standing there and you can see, wow, he's really animated. He's moving around a lot and he's going in and out of focus because you have it set to manual focus. So what do? So you raise the f-stop number from f4 to 1, 2, 3 steps. And those 3 steps equals 1 stop, because they're each a third of a stop. So now we're at 5.6. He can move around a lot, but unfortunately now it's too dark. Well, you don't want to go grab the gray card and hey CEO, can you hold this up in front of your face? You don't want to do that. It's kind of embarrassing. But it's all mathematical. This relationship between ISO, shutter speed, and aperture are all mathematically related. So you can fix this issue really easily by taking your ISO and raising it 1, 2, 3. And as you can see from the light meter, now we're back to exactly where we were before. All right, so let's say you're done with the CEO's interview. And during the interview, remember hearing him talk about his famous Chardonnay. So you're like, I need some B-roll of that. So I'm going to go into the tasting room. There's a bartender behind the bar. You don't have your gray card. It's okay. You got everything set up. You're telling the bartender, hey, can you pour it into this nice glass? And you've got everything set up. Let's say you're a 50th of a second, f2.8, because you want nice shallow depth of field, and you're at ISO 200, nice and low. So it should be a nice clean image. But then you start thinking, wait, before you pour, I want to do this in slow motion. Instead of using slow and quick, you're going to do it this really fast. You're going to go into the menu and you're going to go from 24 up to 60p. And then you're thinking, well, I need to do the 180 degree rule. So I'm going to take the shutter and I'm going to move it up 1, 2, 3, 4 steps. So now it's too dark, but then you're thinking, oh, I'll just raise the ISO up 1, 2, 3, 4 steps, and you can see now we're back to light meters at 0.0. That only took maybe 10-15 seconds. You say, okay, bartender, go ahead and do the pour, hit record, and you've got some nice slow motion. All right, we've already talked about the light meter, the 0.0, even exposure. The next tool that we have at our disposal is the histogram. It's a useful tool. I don't use it all the time, but let me explain what it is if you don't know already. Basically, that you see here, we've got another chart. It's one of these things you can actually fold up, similar to the gray card that we just used, but it's got black, gray, and white. And as you can see, we have 3 spikes on the histogram. There's a black spike on the left, so how to read the histogram is black's on the left, white is on the right, and obviously gray is in the middle. And what's great about this chart for demonstrating this is I can zoom in, and I'm just going to basically fill the frame just with gray, and as you can see, the light meter says it's 0.0. The histogram says that gray patch is pretty much in the middle. At the bottom to the top part of the histogram graph, what does that mean? That's basically your quantity of pixels. And as we can see, we don't have any white pixels and we don't have any black pixels. So as we zoom out a little bit, let's include just a little bit of black and a little bit of white. And you can see the quantity of pixels of white and black are very small in relationship to the gray. And as we zoom all the way out, as you can see, they even out. All right, we've already talked about zebras before, but I wanted to go ahead and demonstrate it right now because we got this great chart and how it relates to the histogram. So as you can see on the histogram, nothing is clipping. There's nothing all the way to the right. And usually when you see pixels stacked up to the far right, that means you're probably losing detail and you're probably clipping something. And if we go all the way in, like we talked about before, we can see that we've got a 0.0 right here. So we know that's properly exposed. We go all the way out. We introduce some white, so now you can see that's gone up 1/3 of a stop, but nothing's clipping. But if I go ahead and turn on the zebra display, which I had set to 100 plus, you can see now there's a little bit of zebras going on right there. And you're like, well, wait a minute. The histogram doesn't show anything's clipping, but that does. The only thing I can understand from the test that I've done to explain this is this histogram pretty much goes from 0 to 109 IRE when you're in the video mode. So this patch that you see here is above 100. It's 100 plus. It's showing you what the 100 plus is. So that's why we're seeing zebras here, but we're not seeing clipping on the histogram. Something that you might not realize is creative styles and picture profiles can affect your exposure. So let me demonstrate really quickly. You can see we're on standard. We've got a little bit of clipping right there. You can see some zebras. If I go to neutral, it's like, whoa, that changed a lot. And you can see down here that the contrast has not changed. I've got these all at zeros. And you can see there's a lot of clipping right there. I changed to portrait. There's not much at all. In fact, portrait of all of them, we're going to discuss this more later, is probably the one that has the greatest dynamic range out of all of them. So if we go back to neutral, and if I were to take the contrast and lower it, you'll see that I got rid of all of that clipping. I just want you to be aware that creative styles, along with their contrast settings, can definitely change your exposure. All right, white balance is really important. It's important to get it right in camera because the more time, even if you spend like an extra minute trying to get the white balance dialed in correctly, it just makes your life so much easier in post. So give yourself an extra minute or two. And I'm going to actually demonstrate this. I'll play a video of me actually fine-tuning the white balance and making decisions. Let's go ahead and press our custom preset button for white balance. The first one is automatic white balance, and actually this camera does pretty well compared to the previous original A7S camera. It didn't do that well. Even outside it wasn't making great choices. But whatever they've done, this is definitely improved, and we're actually going to use this as a tool later. And then it's got a bunch of different presets. So if you're outside, that would be daylight, if it's shade or cloudy. And then as you move indoors, you've got incandescent. That's more of your warmer light. As you can see, it's turned blue here because it's trying to compensate for that. But that would be kind of like an old style light, like a non-fluorescent or non-LED. It's the one with an actual filament, the like Edison created. And then we've got the different fluorescents that you have here. And these are great to step through and try to get it as close as possible. And if you don't have a gray card or something like that, this is a great way to kind of like go through and look at it and like, no, this one looks correct. You're going to kind of do that kind of thing. All right, next up is the Kelvin adjustment. This was where we can make the image warmer to taste or cooler to taste, I guess you could say. I know this light's supposed to be daylight, like 5600 Kelvin, but I know it's not quite that. It's around 5000 or 4800, somewhere around there. And usually these LED lights and fluorescent lights, you have to pull towards or away from green into magenta to get rid of usually a little bit of a green cast. This particular light doesn't have that much of a green cast in it, so I actually leave it at 0. So that's how you adjust your Kelvin adjustment. The next 3 are custom presets that you can actually create, and we're going to go ahead and create 2 of them. Hit the enter button or the center of the jog wheel, and you'll see that black circle comes up, and just go ahead and press the button again. It's going to take a picture, and it's going to give you 2 numbers. This is a little confusing. The number on the bottom is what it says it should be, based off of the gray, which is saying it's 5100, and there's no green or magenta shift or tint to it. And what you see above that number, you can see I've already done this once before. I put it to register 1, but I actually don't want to put it in register 1. I'm going to put it in register. I'm going to cursor over to the number 2, and then I'm going to hit the enter button. So number 2 now has 5100. I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to go ahead and go to set, but this time I'm going to do it to the white area. And let's see what it comes up. Now it says that it's 4700, so it's 300 degrees cooler, I guess you could say. So I'm going to put this in register number 3. So let's go ahead and go back to here. I'm going to toggle between 2 and 3. And to my eye, that looks warmer, and that looks pretty neutral. That looks pretty good. Now remember when I was talking about how automatic white balance in this camera works really well? I use this as a tool because why I set it to 3 is if I move to set and I don't press anything, the difference when I bounce back and forth between 3 and set, nothing's happening. It's not changing the white balance. But when I go from set and I go down to automatic white balance, then the change actually happens. So if I go from automatic white balance to set, nothing happens. So this gives me a way to toggle between 3 and automatic white balance. So this gives me a way to see which one's better. So I'm going to go to 3 and it just changed. I go to set, it doesn't change, but I go to automatic white balance, it changes. And as I toggle between the 2, it's really hard to tell any difference, but I would say probably 3 is a little bit cooler. And automatic white balance is actually maybe a little bit better. So I'm going to go back to 3, and I can't change it here, but I know it's 4700 and basically 0, 0. And I'm going to go up to Kelvin, and I'm going to pretty much set it to 4800. Now, unfortunately, once I'm at 4800, I can't bounce back between the Kelvin adjustment and automatic white balance easily. So now I think I've got it dialed in pretty well. All right, you can see I'm in a gymnasium, and you can see I'm going to do an automatic white balance on the wall. You can see I took it right on the wall there, and you can see it's 3300 and it's a -2 green, or going towards magenta 2. And as you can see, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to bring up the 3 where I registered it, and I'm going to go between automatic white balance, which looks pretty good, go back to 3, and I'm like, well, maybe at 3300 or automatic white balance. And then what I'll do here is I'm going to go into the Kelvin adjustment and kind of cursor around, because I know it's going to be somewhere around 33, and I'm going to be looking at the whole image, like the gym floor. I don't want that too warm. I also want the skin to look correct, and I also want the white walls to look white. So I'm just going to bounce around until I find the correct Kelvin adjustment, because I don't want to keep it on automatic white balance, because if I move the camera around or I zoom in and zoom out, then it might change the white balance, and when I try to go from a tight shot to a wide shot, things won't match up and it just becomes a nightmare. So I'm trying to dial in, like you see I'm at 3200, 34, 33, just inching up and down just to find out where I think the best white balance looks. Just to recap white balance, I just want to say that the automatic white balance of this camera's gotten better. And if you're shooting indoors in a difficult lighting situation, spend the extra maybe minute or 2 just bouncing around like I showed here to try to fine tune it the best you can. It'll save you a lot of time in post.